University, where he has taught for over 40 years. And however, he's not only taught in the UK, he's taught all around the world, including the US, Moldova, Romania, France, Germany, and Sweden. Is that it?
And a few more.
And
yes.
a few more.
No, that's enough. Yes.
He is also author of many of the OU courses that many of you are either doing now or have done in the past, and currently for D100 and D200. And his published books are Biological Psychology, which is a popular textbook in a lot of universities around the world, a book on the work of B.F. Skinner, and more recently his book titled How Sexual Desire Works, The Enigmatic Urge, which he is here to share with us his thoughts about his latest updates on it. And obviously, more importantly, he is president of the Open University Psychology Society, which we are very thankful for. So we are delighted that he could join us this evening, particularly because it is his birthday, and he is taking So I ask you all to welcome Professor Fred Toates.
That was a welcome. I'm delighted to be here. Thank you to London OUPS for the invitation. What I should be presenting is the interpretation I make on how sexual desire works. I have to say at the outset, it's a male view, since I'm simply a male, I'm a heterosexual male, and I try to do justice to other sexes, genders, orientations, but I might not succeed, so let me just say that from the outset. And what I hope to do is to convey something of what's now, well, 50 years of research into how motivation works, not particularly necessarily with sexual motivation, but the general principles of motivation. And I think now I've arrived at something which begins to explain some of the otherwise maybe puzzling phenomena connected. What needs to be explained? Well, what needs to be explained, I would say, is the variation in types of sexual desire, monogamy or variety. Of course, for some people, an absolute monogamous relationship is the only context in which they're interested in sexual desire or have any arousal for sexual desire. Conversely, others are really only turned on by variety and novelty. Then there is orientation, heterosexual, homosexual, bisexual. We need to try to say something about the orientation. Paraphilias, things that are outside of conventional sexuality, such as fetishism, voyeurism and exhibitionism. A good model might say something about these things. Pornography, why are people attracted to pornography? And indeed, why are some people attracted to an addictive level where it surpasses conventional human contact sexuality? Addictive sexual desire, which is a controversial subject, but I believe the term addiction is equally applicable to sex as it is to drugs. This is very controversial. It generates enormous amounts of heat on the Facebook site. It's not OUPS, but others. But I would defend the position that sex can become just as addictive as can heroin or cocaine. And tragically, violent sexual desire, where violence merges with sexual desire to create a toxic, awful combination. And then there is asexuality, where there is no sexual desire. It doesn't mean that there's no sexuality. The person might masturbate, might enjoy masturbation, but there is no reference to another individual in their sexuality at all. So can we say anything about these phenomena? I believe we can, and I believe if we break things down to some simple components and try to put them together again, we can see some logic. Now, traditionally, there has been what's called drive theories, and I would say that two of the best known here are Freud and Watson, and in their idea, then something builds up intrinsic within the individual. It builds up to such a point that it has to be released in the form of some kind of sexual behavior. And then the system is quiescent for a time, and then it builds up again, and so on. So it's somewhat analogous, crudely, to urination. I think it's not a particularly helpful way of looking at it. In the case of Freud, there was the notion of a kind of energy build-up that needs discharge. But then some people find flirting and kissing short of orgasm to be attractive and desirable, which is difficult to explain in terms of some lowering of energy, because if anything, I would imagine that they would increase energy levels. John Watson has his internal factor, the tension within the seminal vesicles, but since they're not possessed by 50% of the population, then it rather falls flat. Watson suggested for that 50% of the population that learning is the answer. And I think he's right, but I equally think he's right about the male population as well. I don't think seminal vesicles get us very far. Freud actually entertained this idea as well. You'll find in Freud's writing that it's all the energy comes from the seminal vesicles. Now, when you come to look at Maslow, so this must be one of the most reproduced diagrams in the whole history of psychology. It's, wherever you look, whether it's business management, whether it's social psychology, whatever it is, you see this hierarchy of needs proposed by Maslow. It's been enormously influential, and fundamentally I think it's flawed in its very most basics. Because if you look at the bottom here, then whatever variant it's presented as, then there are physiological needs there that have to be satisfied before you go up the hierarchy, and right at the top you have things like self-actualization needs and so on. Where I think it's fundamentally flawed is that sex is just not like eat, breathing, food, sleep, excretion. If they are thwarted, then death will follow, make no mistake about it. Whereas if sex is thwarted, death will not follow. It may be uncomfortable for some people, it might not be. Some people live perfectly happily an asexual life. So there is nothing really going on as terms of physiological disturbance in their bodies. So I think it's fundamentally flawed, and I think that for some people they would put love, belonging down there. I think that Maslow read too much Freud and took it too seriously. I think that here women going into prison don't tell you the first thing they'd miss is sex. They tend to tell you it's their family, and their social bonds is the first thing they'll miss. So clearly there's a lot wrong with this hierarchy of needs here. What I think with sex is, here is an American author, Peter Trachtenberg. I was intolerably drawn to other women, some I knew and some I just glimpsed across a subway platform on my way to work. What overcame me in their presence left me trembling. God knows what those women thought when they saw a strange man gazing at them with such waif-like yearning. What I think Trachtenberg is illustrating here very well is that it's not a physiological disturbance that is disturbing him in the sense of something within the body outside the brain. Rather, it is the attraction of novelty, because he was already in a relationship, but he was being tormented by the sight of women on the opposite platform on the New York subway, which he articulates very well. So I think that this is the nature, it's a psychological, and it can even be, as I say in a moment, a kind of psychological homeostasis, but not physiological. What I want to propose is an incentive-based model, but I want to also talk about sexual arousal plus a hierarchy of control, and I think that gives us a purchase on this. Triggers to desire in these terms are incentives. There are things out there in the environment, food, water, drugs, in this case sex, a sexual partner, conditional stimuli associated with incentives, classical conditioning. So what arouses sexual desire is things like a perfume that's been associated with sexual desire in the past. Cognitive representations of incentives, we carry them around in our head. We don't just feel desire when we see an attractive other, we have a representation of the attractive other in our head. And meaning attached to incentives. This is another factor I will emphasize. Uncertainty and its resolution is a powerful aphrodisiac for some people. Putting in a situation of uncertainty about does he, doesn't he, does she, doesn't she show an interest in me, and resolving it, that can be a powerful aphrodisiac. So the incentive theory that I propose as an alternative to drive theory puts the emphasis upon the external world. So if there is hyposexual desire, I'm not looking for some low energy level within the individual. I'm looking at a history of learning. The person has learned by their experience that sex has not brought them much joy in the past, and hence they've devalued it. Conversely, with hypersexual desire, as in addiction, I'm not looking for some internal factor, some set point that's turned up to too high a level. I'm seeing a history of learning where sex has solved problems in the person's past. They've engaged in sexual activity, it's brought some enormous boost to their standing, and that therefore it has been highly valued. And this has a practical application, because when Viagra came out, there was talk about devising Viagra for women. You don't hear anything about it anymore. So it was said that women with hyposexual desire, if only you give them Viagra, they might become normal, if not hypersexual. It's been a complete failure, because in my view it's looking in the wrong place. It's looking at the internal plumbing of the body, whereas the problem with hypersexuality is a learned history of bad associations. And turning up the plumbing is not going to solve it. I'll say more about this in a while. Now, central to all this is the work of my colleagues in the United States. Jaak Panksepp is tragically not with us anymore on this earth. Ken Berridge and Terry Robinson, University of Michigan and Bowling Green State University, Ohio, particularly Robinson and Berridge, they identified two principal motivational pathways. There's this one here, which is termed subcortical. It's shared with non-human species. It's much the same in rats and dogs and humans. And it is the wanting pathway, it's the urge pathway, it's the thing that pulls us to incentives. And it's perfectly general, no matter what the incentive, that pathway is activated if you're being pulled towards it. Then you have a higher level pathway, mediated by the prefrontal cortex here, that can both exert excitation and inhibition. That's the high level conscious control. This one is largely mediated at an unconscious level, though the products become conscious, but the urge can arise completely unconscious, even by subliminal presentations of an attractive image. The person's urge can be triggered. So this one then is excitation. This is refined, this is crude and basic. This is system 1 here. This is system 2, the sophisticated, consciously driven system. Now there is spillover, because since I propose there is a common incentive pathway, then if that pathway is triggered in some way and it can't be fulfilled, then it's spilled over somewhere else. And advertisers may know nothing at all about dopamine, but they certainly know about how to use that pathway to their advantage. So in a case like this, clearly for most males, if not all males walking past here, what is on offer here is quite unavailable. What is here is available, but their checkbook can't usually afford it, but they forget that at the time because the spillover of excitation from the women to the car is so strong that they tend to sign up, swipe their credit card for the car. It's well known. So this is, I think, the basis of this is a common dopaminergic pathway which serves any craving, any urge, but different things get access to it. So when the system is sensitized to sex, as in someone who is hypersexual, this is this basic dopamine pathway here, and you have various candidates for control, and when sex is dominant, then I've indicated this by a thick arrow, it tends to have privileged access to this pathway here. Others can be devalued. Matter might not be devalued, but they can be devalued. Current thinking in autism research, to some researchers, is that the social is devalued in the case of individuals with autism relative to the others, but that is controversial. This takes us a bit off our subject. Bringing different areas of research together, sexual incentive process interacts with other processes. There's not a single one-to-one link between motives and incentives. Sex is interactive. David Buss and Cindy Meston, in their book on why women have sex, list 237 different reasons, only 2 of which are sexual pleasure and having babies. That still leaves 235 unaccounted for, and these vary from the altruistic, since I saw the guy sitting there all evening and no one would look at him, to the somewhat less altruistic, that I wanted to hit back at that bitch because she slept with my guy. To get rid of a headache, to feel good about myself, to social standing, to being part of the club. All of these reasons, that's only exhausted about 6 of them, there's still 231 to go. My hunch is that a male, equivalent male book would be much shorter. Now, sexual desire doesn't exist in isolation, it interacts with other desires, and here is one, attachment motivation. This is a strong one for people in monogamous relationships. In fact, they could be quite conditional that there is such an association before feeling any desire whatsoever. They are 2 distinct systems though. Freud got this quite wrong. They're quite distinct systems, and indeed, one of them could be homosexual and the other could be heterosexual, or vice versa. So they're 2 distinct systems. They normally lock into interaction so that the same incentive for romance is the incentive for sexual desire as well. They're normally locked into an integrated system there, with oxytocin probably mediating the link between them. Another one, sadly, is this one, where the power dominance motivation, this is a male thing, it's possibly a female thing too in some cases, but if it is, it's not been acknowledged in the literature. But there is definitely a male thing, males who are turned on by dominating females tend then to lock this interaction with their sexual desire, with of course tragic consequences in some cases. Here is another one where 2 distinct systems can lock interaction. Drugs. There can be a deliberate maximization and cross-triggering, and the drugs that are the most potent aphrodisiacs are the ones that have a direct action on dopaminergic systems. Most obviously cocaine and methamphetamine. Methamphetamine is a favourite. It might be also in the heterosexual community, I guess it is, but it's certainly established its reputation in the United States in the gay community as the drug of choice, as an aphrodisiac, which not just creates a wanting, it gives enormous stamina as well to keep going through marathon orgies of sexuality, and it also turns down the assessment of risk. So guys in this situation tend to run high risks. Cannabis is a mild aphrodisiac. It acts on both the liking and the wanting systems. It's cross-triggering there. So if someone's being treated for combined drug sex addiction, you need to treat both addictions. If you don't, if you treat just one, even if you appear to be succeeding with it, then the moment they get the stimulus of the other one, it will set it off because of cross-triggering. Hierarchical control I'll speak about in a moment. Evolutionary psychology is relevant. Excitation and inhibition are both relevant here. Some organising principles now. Incentive motivation. My colleagues at the University of Michigan distinguish between wanting and liking. There they greatly improved on my model, which they based their work on, but they greatly improved it. I had wanting and liking sharing common machinery, but they split them apart and showed that they really are quite distinct machineries underlying wanting and liking. They normally vary in harmony with each other, what you want you like, and what you like you want, but there can be a dissociation, and they have established...
Could you distinguish what we mean by wanting and liking?
Well, the amount of effort you're prepared to exert to get to a goal. In the case of a rat, the number of frequency of presses in a lever box to get to food, say, whereas the liking is actually the reaction to food once it's in the mouth. So it is roughly the old appetitive consometry you might remember from early days of psychology with the ethological approaches. So wanting, according to my colleagues, there's very good evidence now, is mediated via dopamine, whereas liking is mediated by natural opioids. Wanting, this dopamine is a common currency. Any want is mediated via dopamine, which begins to explain how they can interact and go towards a goal driven by various contributory factors. So this model of incentive motivation provides a unifying principle across motivations. Some of them are homeostatic, like feeding and drinking. Some, like sex, aren't. Some, like drugs, are quite artificial. But nonetheless, they all follow incentive principles. And here, the way feeding and drinking work is that a nutrient deficiency sensitizes the incentive pull of food. Fluid deficiency sensitizes the incentive pull of water. Drugs, there can be a withdrawal effect. They'll become particularly attractive at times of withdrawal. Now, sex, hormones sensitize sexual incentive and thoughts of incentives. So that's somewhat like the nutrient deficiency and the fluid deficiency. However, it is different in that you're not homeostatically regulating the sex hormone level, and if it gets out of kilter for whatever reason, it's not fatal. In fact, you don't need the sex hormone, you can live perfectly well without it. So that's an important difference here. Anticipation of hedonism, I would say that any motivation, an important part of it is the anticipation of hedonism. Sexual behaviour can be, of course, motivated by an anticipation of hedonism, but in this case I would suspect that the girls are more motivated by drug hedonism rather than sexual hedonism. It's where's the next fix going to come from, with very often tragic consequences, as in the case of, say, the Suffolk Ripper. They'll get into anybody's car to get their next fix, but they're not obviously not motivated. So this is why the sexual behaviour itself, the number of outlets, doesn't necessarily reflect on sexual desire. Coolidge effect, the trigger of desire by a novel stimulus. Again, this makes no sense in terms of regulation, because presenting a novel stimulus is not going to create some homeostatic disturbance, but can be a very potent stimulus as represented here. The implication of incentive model, there can be highly specific targets of desire, e.g. fetishes. So, yeah.
Can you just talk for a second about the Coolidge effect?
Yes. Can I do it later? It's named after President Coolidge of the United States. I'll tell the story at the end. It's a turn-on by sexual novelty, okay, where the familiar partner doesn't turn on, but a novel partner does. Remind me at the end, I'll talk about it then. So in this interpretation, the harm in thwarting sex comes from psychological frustration. There's no tissue damage involved as far as we know. And again, where Freud got it wrong, Freud saw both masturbation and fantasy as in some sense substitutes for the real thing. But this is fundamentally flawed, because often both fantasy and masturbation can be high at a time of high sexual activity. Meeting a new partner, for example, and sometimes it can be low at a time when there's no sexual outlet. So that it doesn't work. It does fit very well in incentive interpretation. Triggers to fantasy. Automatic intrusive. So one can be walking down the street and not looking at anywhere in particular, and suddenly images of sexual desire can come into your head, particularly if in the past they've been associated with relief of tension of some sort, with an improvement in mood, then they can come into your head. Deliberately conscious, of course, you can deliberately incite them for whatever reason. You might wish to masturbate with them. You may be with one partner and find not particularly exciting, and you wish to fantasize about a different partner. And that's one thing. Woody Allen said that you tend to find a better class of person with masturbation. They can be externally triggered. The sight of someone in the street who is sexually attractive, then can of course run off the whole sequence of whatever you wish to do with this someone. Sexual arousal triggered, you can wake up in the middle of the night feeling sexually aroused, and then that triggers fantasies appropriate to the sexual arousal. And what we find with fantasy is that these same basic dopaminergic systems, including the low-level system, is active both in fantasy and in actual stimulation. So fantasizing about someone is much the same as far as dopamine goes as actually seeing them, being with them. And this has a clear forensic implication, because what I suggest is happening, sex offenders to a man, and they almost always are men, fantasize a great deal. And what I suggest is happening is, in their fantasies, they are sensitizing those particular incentives that they're entertaining in their conscious mind at the time. And so in a forensic setting, the staff in a forensic prison situation are very vigilant about the kind of fantasies their prisoners are holding, because They're not some innocent byproduct. They could well be integral to the whole motivational process. Is sexual fantasy welcome? Well, I don't know. Maybe you can tell me whether it's welcome or not. There's an interesting argument put forward by John May, whose presence we had the pleasure of a couple of years ago at Warwick from University of Plymouth. He and a couple of colleagues developed a very interesting argument, and I think it fits, that sexual fantasy is welcome under some conditions, particularly if you have some hope of enacting the fantasy in practice. If you don't, then it can be tormenting. And there is an interesting article written by a sex-linked serial killer, Michael Ross, that was published in the journal Sexual Addiction and Compulsivity. He was the last prison to be executed in Connecticut. And he wrote this article about his sexual fantasies and how they tormented him in prison. Well, yes, of course, I can understand they would, because he couldn't enact them in prison. Whereas when he was free, I doubt very much whether they tormented him to the same degree, particularly if he felt he got a victim lined up. It's the most horrendous subject, I know, but it's worth investigating.